Hello everyone, I am the Script Monk. This is going to be a shorter one, but I just want to start off by saying this is going to be more stuff you're only going to hear from me, either here or in one of my books, because it's my concept. I developed it. I'm not some dude who just repeats what other people say. So if you hear this from anyone else, they're ripping me off. Now, as you may know, Hollywood development types have a habit of dividing all movies into two categories. A movie is either plot-driven or it's character-driven. The idea being that a plot-driven movie is one that places most of its emphasis on the twists and turns of story events, and a character-driven movie is one that gives far more attention to what makes people tick, with the frequent assumption that the more there is of one element, the less there must be of the other. But when it comes down to it, these plot-driven, character-driven labels, they're just kind of stupid. This is first of all because the labels themselves are nonsense. Plot and character are the two sides of the story coin, so every story is driven by both plot and character. As long as one event logically leads to another, a story is driven by a plot. And unless we're talking about a science documentary where no human being ever appears, the story's also driven by characters, since no plot event occurs without a person making it occur through some internal motivation. Second, any judgment on what's plot-driven versus character-driven is purely subjective. How exactly does one quantify whether a movie has more plot or more character? Well, this might be easy for, say, an action movie that has flat, stereotypical characters, or a non-narrative art film where nothing ever really happens, but how would you judge, say, a movie like Schindler's List? The film is far more focused on human thematics than most Spielberg films, but this exploration of human nature is structured in stages marked by clear plot turning points. Or for a more recent film, how about Darren Aronofsky's The Whale? On the one hand, The Whale is a complex character study of a man struggling with the pain caused by all his mistakes in life, but this is all motivated by plot structured around his failing health and the relational arc with his estranged daughter. So are these movies plot-driven, or are they character-driven? Really, it's a pointless argument, because when it comes down to it, plot-driven is just suit speak for movie studios like because they're easy to market, while character-driven means a movie that's icky and poopy because they have no idea what to do with it. Yet despite all this, the suits are blindly grasping at some sort of truth, because there are indeed two general modes of popular movie storytelling. But weighing plot versus character is comparing apples to oranges. If you want to compare apples to apples, we gotta define these two modes structurally. See, when people say plot-driven or character-driven, what they're really trying to get at is that a movie is either antagonism-driven or protagonism-driven. Now before getting into this, I gotta say this applies only to movies with traditional narratives in the canonic problem, action, resolution form, which is over 99% of all movies. It doesn't apply to experimental narratives or films that use a non-narrative or anti-narrative approach. Also, I can't state with confidence how well this holds up for movies from countries outside the Hollywood sphere of influence, as every cultural ideology generates its own variations on storytelling. Anywho, when someone calls a movie plot-driven, what they usually mean is the story is driven by antagonism, meaning some disruptive force other than the main character. This is the mode that predominates the majority of popular movies, but I wouldn't say the vast majority, I'd say about 2/3 to 3/4. An antagonism-driven story begins with the main character, the protagonist, existing in a relatively stable, more or less acceptable status quo. Then, some outside force, something external to the protagonist and beyond their control, disrupts that status quo. Now, this disruptive force can be anything. It could be another character like a villain, it could be a natural cataclysm like an earthquake, or an historical development like the outbreak of war. In any case, this outside force disrupts the protagonist's life in an unexpected and often highly undesirable way. The story then sees the protagonist responding to this disruption by taking actions intended to re-establish the status quo. But these efforts are continually rebuffed by continued actions by the outside force, causing drama to escalate. Basically, the story presents a radical force creating unwanted change, opposed by a protagonist who serves as a conservative force trying to restore order. Essentially, the story plays on our fear of chaos and our desire for stability. In the end, the protagonist must defeat, outlast, or otherwise escape from this antagonistic force to re-establish a new status quo. Now in contrast, when someone calls a movie character-driven, what they're often trying to get at is that the story is protagonism-driven. In many ways, a protagonism-driven story is the mirror opposite of an antagonism-driven story, as much of the dramatic setup has been reversed. First of all, in a protagonism-driven story, the problem no longer disrupts the status quo. Rather, the problem is the status quo. The The story begins with the protagonist living a life or operating in a situation they find unsatisfying, unfair, or intolerable. As long as the status quo endures, things will stay less than ideal. So, the inciting incident occurs not through some external trigger, but through the protagonist's voluntary decision to do something to change their current life or situation. This time, nothing is really forcing the protagonist to take action. They act because they want to act. In other words, the story's drama comes not from the outside in, as we find in antagonism-driven stories, but from the inside out. Rather than the outside world attacking the character is attacking the outside world. This reverses the previous dynamic, because now the protagonist is the radical force creating change. As such, the opposition now comes from conservative forces who don't want to see the status quo change. To them, the protagonist is a troublemaker who needs to be brought in line. So now it's the opposition who responds with efforts to reassert the status quo, while the protagonist is the one who must continually escalate to greater and greater extremes. Really, it's the same narrative structure. We're simply reversing who serves as the radical disruptive force and who or what serves as the conservative opposition, along with where the audience's sympathy should lie. The story is either about a quest for change or a response to unwanted change. Now, the form and the intensity of the conflict in protagonism-driven narratives is all a matter of the chosen style and tone. The movie might indeed have a clash of two warring parties, or the conservative opposition might remain subtle and implied. As such, we can find protagonism-driven narratives in a wide variety of genres and story types, well beyond the slow-paced dramas we typically think of when we hear the term character-driven. From romantic comedies of characters seeking new love, to social dramas of heroes taking on corrupt systems, to crime and gangster movies of characters chasing their dreams by defying the law. And if you don't think these movies can be as thrilling as the antagonism-driven sort, look at something like Fight Club. Fight Club is protagonism-driven, in that everything originates from the protagonist's discontent with modern life, turning him into a radical force. Now, once we know that the key factor is who or what disrupts the status quo, we can see how off the mark a lot of the old plot-driven versus character-driven labels can often be. Because you'll often find movies people call plot-driven that are in fact driven by protagonism, like The Bourne Identity. Though it's obscured a bit by its amnesia angle, The Bourne Identity is the story of a man who wants to break away from his old life to achieve freedom and independence. However, Bourne's rebellion triggers the ire of an ultra-conservative force who would rather kill Bourne than see him alter their status quo. Or take a comedy like Coming to America. Prince Akeem is a rebel, bucking all conventions to seek happiness on his own terms. But in this quest, Akeem faces several forces of conservative opposition, from his stubbornly traditional father, to Mr. McDowell's paternalism, to Lisa's established relationship with Daryl, to various social prejudices about class and culture. Conversely, something we might call character-driven might in fact be driven by antagonism. Say we got a movie about a character who receives a cancer diagnosis. Well, the character didn't certainly choose to have cancer. This is an outside force that has invaded their life. Though the story might be executed through slow-paced scenes of character-revealing dialogue, we mustn't confuse tone with structure. We're still dealing with a story of a character battling an exterior force to restore a status quo. But just like all categories in screencraft, there are no hard boundaries between antagonism-driven and protagonism-driven narratives. Both structures are flexible enough to allow mixed types, something we can see in something as basic as an Adam Sandler comedy. Happy Gilmore starts out as antagonism-driven. The bank is threatening to take Happy's grandmother's house. Happy becomes a golfer only in response to this outside threat, hoping to earn enough money to get the house back and restore the status quo. But in this quest, Happy becomes a radical force invading the highly conservative world of professional golf. As such, while the bank seizure remains a motivating force, the main source of conflict isn't the bank, but a representative of this conservative golf world. Happy Gilmore thus creates a protagonism-driven narrative embedded within an antagonism-driven narrative, contrived so that the resolution of one will also resolve the other. It's also possible to transition from one type to another, as happens in the original Star Wars. Though on the whole, Star Wars is about a bunch of radical rebels trying to destroy the status quo of an ultra-conservative empire, our protagonist Luke Skywalker starts out in a stable status quo, suddenly disrupted through a chance encounter with rebel droids. With this outside invasion, Luke's life is turned upside down and made progressively worse by escalating actions from the malevolent external force. Yet as Luke matures, he starts to take charge of his situation, moving things in a protagonism-driven direction. After all, Luke didn't have to join the big attack on the Death Star. He could have left with Han.
but Luke chooses to join the battle out of the personal desire to claim his heroic identity. In fact, through subplots and relational arcs, you can find a lot of movies that mix protagonism and antagonism-driven threads. My point is the same one I always try to make. Structure is flexible, not rigid. Good structure adjusts to the needs of the story. It doesn't try to cram the story into a restrictive mold. So don't think I'm trying to tell you can only tell two types of story. So in conclusion, don't learn screencraft from Suits. When Suits say plot-driven or character-driven, they're just trying to separate movies they know how to market from those they don't know what to do with. But antagonism-driven and protagonism-driven narratives are two equally effective ways to tell a compelling story that'll work for any genre, style, or tone. Whether or not the resulting film is marketable or not depends on other factors entirely. If you want to hear more about my particular approach to screencraft, you can pick up one of my books. This is Screenwriting Down to the Atoms. It's for beginners. This is Screenwriting the Unified Theory of Narrative. It's for non-beginners. And as always, please like, comment, and subscribe because it really helps the video get seen by more people and helps the channel grow. So until next time, I'm the Script Monk. Thanks for watching.